Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to the Clements Bookworm. Oh, what episode are we in? I think I've lost track. I think we're on episode 8. Let me double check the notes. Yes, episode 8 of the Bookworm. Who knew that we'd continue on for so long? Thank you everybody for supporting us in this way. I just want to mention that today's episode will be recorded and then we'll share it online. So this afternoon, you will receive an email with that recording and any other links or resources that are mentioned during today's broadcast. Just want to give you a quick tutorial. It looks like people are finding the chat, so continue to chime in there. It's great if you can select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you're saying and we can continue to build a nice community. You'll notice that the conversation goes by very quickly. So if you have a specific question for the panelists, please click on the Q&A section instead. That's a great place to ask your questions because they won't get sort of lost in the quagmire of the chat. And you can also upvote. There's a little thumbs up if it's a question that you have as well. And then if we type the answers in, they'll be posted right there with the question, or we can choose to answer those questions online. My colleagues Ann Bennington-Helber and Therese Austin will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A and helping to answer some questions and post related links in the chat. So thank you both for doing that. In addition, we've had other questions about how to change your screen in Zoom. So I wanted to point out that you can click side-by-side mode if you do view options and then click side-by-side mode, and then you'll see the speaker beside the slides rather than on top of them. So just wanted to get, and you can change how much of each that you see. So hopefully that's helpful in making this experience good for you. We all keep learning about Zoom. So by the end of the stay-at-home order, we'll all be experts. And that'll probably be time for them to change it all around so that we know nothing. But in the meantime, there's a couple more tips for you. All right. Today's program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. Now, some of you who have been with this program since the very beginning heard our story about how we decided to do this program. So you see our researchers sitting there in the reading room. It's very quiet in the reading room. But then at 10 o'clock every morning, we ring a bell and they're invited to join the curators and staff and each other in the tea room to discuss their research. And it's just an amazing time to get to know each other, to find new resources, and to hear what kinds of other books people are reading and really build a community. So that's what we were hoping to replicate, at least in a small way, with this Bookworm program. So thank you all for joining us for this. All right, in a moment, we're going to get to our two panelists today. We're talking about American histories and the struggle for equality. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to take our poll. We're talking about what tools you use to explore your family history. And you'll hear a little bit more about that, especially in Rex's talk today. I'm going to end the polling and share the results. And it looks like photographs and scrapbooks won out with 81% of the people saying that that's how they've learned about their family history. So that gives us all a big challenge, right? That we have to update those photographs and scrapbooks for the next generation. It's a little daunting with as many digital photographs as I take. So, but I do have it documented in fits and spurts. I don't know about you guys, but Rex, are you pretty good at keeping up on your photo album?
I have a wonderful companion who puts everything on the CDs and on the computer.
Oh, nice. That's lovely. Well, it looks like a lot of us also have a lot of good information and connections with our relatives, so that's great too. So thanks everybody for taking the time to participate in that poll. Our first speaker today is Hayley O'Malley. And Hayley is a PhD candidate in English literature and African American studies at the University of Michigan and has a degree in film studies from Oxford University. Her research and teaching focus broadly on 20th and 21st century African American literature, visual culture, and film, with a particular emphasis on Black women's art and activism. So Hayley, what book are you sharing with us today?
I'm going to be talking about Toni Cade Bambara's 1972 debut short story collection, Gorilla My Love.
Oh, great. Please go ahead and tell us more.
Great. Well, first, I'm just so delighted to be here. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be part of this really incredible series. Our theme today, struggle for equality, that certainly happens in the streets, in courtrooms, in schools, but also happens in the arts through music, film, photography, theater, and dance. And my research on 20th century African American cultural production in particular is really concerned with thinking about the relationship between artistic innovation and political change, and also the relationship between different forms of art making, different media. So my dissertation is all about how in the 1960s, African-American writers get really fascinated in experimenting with filmmaking and how that changes their literature and also the trajectory of American film history. So Toni Cade Bambara, writer, filmmaker, Black feminist, and self-proclaimed media activist, is very much at the heart of the story I'm trying to tell. So Bambara grew up in Harlem. She was an avid film goer from a very young age. But she very soon became dismayed by the representation of, or lack thereof, of Blackness on the silver screen. So this is American film history that is built on films like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. It's a film industry that is built on racist hiring and marketing practices. That's been really helpfully chronicled by a scholar, Marianne Arriga, in a book that's called, helpfully, The Hollywood Jim Crow. And so Bambara really was committed to changing this. And she saw herself as part of a Black film movement in the period of 1970. And she contributed to that through her filmmaking, but also through her literature. So I'll tell you a little bit about this title story that I think is really lovely and delightful and has a fantastic message. It's a story about Hazel. She is a young Black girl growing up in Harlem, like Bambara. She also is an avid moviegoer. And so she and her friends go to the movies and are very excited by seeing this film with an intriguing title, Gorilla My Love. When they get there, though, the manager has switched the films, has put in a 1920s silent epic that Hazel has already seen in Sunday school. And so she's outraged, she protests, but the film continues on anyway. But she doesn't leave. She stays and is actually really absorbed in the film, so much so that when her friend crumbles potato chips in her hair, she doesn't even notice. And so she watches the film, but she's so absorbed because she's actually imagining her own film. She's imagining her family in the roles of the characters. And she's delighted by the results, and they're acting very differently. So when both of Hazel's film and the film at large end, she decides that she really should get her money back. It was false advertising after all. And so she confronts the manager. The manager says no, and Hazel decides to get revenge by burning down the candy stand. So I'm saying that Bambara, I don't think, is advocating a wholesale burning down of candy stands. She's actually up to something much more ambitious, I think, which is one that she's showing the lengths at which Black spectators had to go. They have to imagine their own film to see their own family stories shown on screen. And she's also showing that instead of just thinking about the assumed white male spectatorship, what happens if we think about film viewing from the perspective of a Black girl and implicitly the Black woman who's writing this story? So she's anticipating the work of someone like Bell Hooks. And I think the lesson that this really very, very short story tells is a lesson in critical media spectatorship that is potentially even more relevant today when we're met by this sort of barrage of images.
Thank you, Hayley. How many stories are in the book?
Oh gosh, I think it's about, let's see, a dozen, close to 15. And a lot of those stories are often excerpted and put into anthologies that you might have encountered as a high school student. Certainly when I was teaching 9th grade in our short story unit, where we did theme and setting and character development and dialogue, Bambara's stories would show up there. But often in those lessons, the politics is left out, is not included. And certainly I think when you read through the whole collection, you get this really robust and vibrant story that was published by Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison and Bambara were really great friends. So this was the beginning of a lifelong friendship and collaboration between the two Tonys.
Thank you. You mentioned your dissertation, and so maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about how in your research you found that the arts relate to the struggle for equality.
Yeah, so I think certainly with someone like Bambara, she says that in the early 1970s, she goes to Cuba, and she comes back and she realized just like that trip really made me realize that what I do, the writing that I do, is part of this movement. It's part of a movement for changing a larger cultural consciousness. The struggle for equality, yes, happens in the streets often through marches, but it's also about trying to create a larger conversation, change people's minds. And that can happen through a morning with a short story and trying to see the world from a different perspective.
Interesting. Well, great. So I just want to remind people that if you have specific questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A section, and we'll answer questions at the end of the presentations. So thank you, Hayley. I'm sure that we'll think of more things that we'd like to ask you about, but I'm definitely intrigued to read more of these short stories.
Yeah, my pitch here is just read Toni Cade Bambara. You can read this, you can read her Atlanta child murders book, you can read her essays, you can read her anthologies. Come see me and I'll give you a packet.
Very nice. Thank you so much. All right. So there's Toni Cade Bambara again, and now we'll hear from Rex Hauser. So let's see, Rex has his PhD from the University of Michigan in Romance Languages and has been a long time Clements Library Associate, and happily has participated in all of our Bookworm programs. So thank you, Rex, for being here.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so you have an interesting thread that you're going to be discussing today. I thought it would be interesting for you to tell us a little bit more about this image that's in the background of your photo.
Okay, as I explained in my talk, which I'll be mostly reading, that's the Thompson family tree. It dates from 1890, yet 1700 is the approximate time of the patriarch, the father of James Thompson, who with his wife Mary came to America in about 1771. And they had 5 children with them, and born in Ireland. So they're Scots-Irish, and I'll explain that in the talk too. And it pretty much ends. There are some extra families written in after 1890, but you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically 5 generations involved in it.
And Rex, you're the current caretaker of this amazing family heirloom, right?
There are other copies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
I
So what
keep
we
the history.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't you go ahead and talk to us a little bit more?
Okay. Most of us have romantic ideas about the Underground Railroad, and it has been fictionalized. I suppose faced with a lack of eyewitness accounts or written reports. There is the initial work of Siebert of the late 1890s and subsequent work that has added to it. Some people think it was actually a network of trains. Some still don't know what a lot of motivation, hard work, strategy, and brilliance that it required, or how much the desire for liberty affecting huge swaths of the developing nation, in particular for those who were in bondage yet had built a lot of the country. We as a nation are not enamored of causes with a moral ring to them, even in the academy or as public intellectuals with little role in the public eye. For the most part, it's traditional to avoid religion as a factor of history. Where are the public advocates to challenge pseudo-evangelical or internet revisions of our founding fathers and mothers' beliefs, for example? Work on abolition and anti-slavery in the 21st century may help us to rectify this situation. Our history, as much as possible, must be told. You might see my bibliography, and I don't know if you're going to publish online the talk with the bibliography that goes with it. That would be great.
Yes,
But,
we can do that.
Okay. And I still have some revisions. I'm always revising. Um, and we are able to include African American history as part and parcel of American history as a whole, then we have a good start on the big picture. And my note, footnote here, includes Cheryl LaRoche and her archaeology done in Indiana. I choose the term enslaved over slave because slave perpetuates an identity imposed upon full and real human beings based on color and physical traits decreed by perceived negative differences between races. The enslaved, when they could get free, risked everything for liberty, for their development and their families. And in large part, they, excuse me, I need some water. They formed the humble vanguard and motive force of the Underground Railroad. They were assisted by whites and their brethren of somewhat, or who were somewhat or somehow free, the free people of color. The railroad conductors were, for the most part, believers in a God both of liberty and of justice, often AME or Baptist, often Quakers or Presbyterians. They were believers in the founding ideals of this country, as Cox and Aunt Lisa Cox attests in her book, The Bone and Sinew of the Land. That was the link between our founding revolution and our union. They were not fashionable, nor were they tolerated any more than those struggling against human trafficking today are fashionable, although they are tolerated. If all the country or the world were abolitionist today, because there still is slavery, there would be no more trafficking, and Native and other women of color would be free to move about as they wished. When about 10 years ago, I came across Anne Hagedorn's Beyond the River, I was delighted to find so many parallels with my mother's family tree. Did I have history in my ancestral past? Nearly all my life, the Thompson family tree had been pointed to with pride, with 5 generations dating to 1700, yet hardly anyone had really read it, with its little annotated narratives and accomplishments in 1890 calligraphy. The story of the little orphan girl, her parents recently deceased, adopted by one of the great Underground Railroad families in American history, the Rankins, in the late 1820s. Who knew that? What I've found is a lot of history in the tree, indeed a time capsule of early American history. I've also found a spiritual connection to the foundation of my own early work in civil rights from the time that I was 15, and my support for Black Power. I can say that I came by this honestly, as someone pointed out. I began the multicultural part of my life by listening to and appreciating all kinds of people. I've lived in many places, though I'm a Michigander since 1963 with a bug for adventure. The journey continues as I appreciate different gifts that are bestowed on all by a creator who plays no favorites. I think that natural law, as found in the nation's declaration, and the theology of human rights that my ancestors possessed were often very similar. What does it mean now for all of us to be heirs to an American Revolution that declared itself as a struggle for freedom against both tyranny and evil, as a deep struggle for human rights. In 2020, we have some work to do. For me, part of this is to know my Scottish ancestors' fight for survival in tribal kinship, often leading to national identity, Scottish, which would be subsumed by the new nation's creation and by the Union. My part is tied to how Covenanters were persecuted on the moors of Scotland, as my mother sought to impress upon me as an item of family history. Covenanter was a name for what persecution meant, wreaked upon true believers, chased from their sanctuaries, then from their fields, while the pastors were beheaded. In my research, I saw how they believed in nationhood and church together. I came to find out in my journey that in Penn's Woods, one of the American colonies, in November of 1743, a certain Reverend Alexander Craighead of South Central Pennsylvania and his community of faith declared themselves free and independent of the crown. They declared it with swords raised high, a sign of a serious oath, though in doing so, they bucked up against the colonial era church. They were rebuked by their synod, a governing body, and went into exile in Virginia and then North Carolina. But their recent ancestors had lived roughly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, perhaps in search of isolated beauty. So in the Carolina mountains, they flourished. There and in other parts of the frontier, Scots-Irish would rise up readily in 1775 to throw off the crown and its defenders under new flags and new declarations. Their battle with Native America, allies of the British, or innocent neutrals, were to be terrible and prolonged, even well through the 1780s and 1790s. The cultural, political, and military war was to continue in the War of 1812. Meanwhile, in pre-revolution Pennsylvania, you found an odd blend of peaceable Quakers and German-speaking Anabaptists at the east, and not so peaceable Scots-Irish at the west. The Sylvan utopia of Penn, not for these. They had fought for everything they had, didn't care for paperwork, outside government, official money, or meddling in their lifeways. They had been hired, in a way, to be a buffer between the peaceful utopia in the east and the native people who might fight, and did fight, against encroachment. They were aided by a Scottish Quaker governor, Logan, in the early 1700s. Scottish culture might have involved some whiskey, still embodied in the noun and adjective Scotch, but moreover, it was the spirit of a different sort that defined them. A short catechism and the scriptures were found everywhere. They pined for a preacher to come and meet their needs of baptisms, weddings, and more. They did hard work, rarely improving the quality of the land. They enjoyed camaraderie, binding themselves by family, friendship, song, and the great communion festivals that harked back to Catholic times in the Scottish homelands. You can see Cane Ridge, America's Pentecost by Paul Conkin, about the 1801 gathering. Amazing kind of revival that changed the face of Kentucky's wild early culture. The Thompsons were part of that, even as organizers, alongside the sister church Cane Ridge, under Reverend Barton Stone. In a nutshell, the Scots-Irish were those Scots who passed through Northern Ireland for however many years or decades on their way across the pond, or who stayed behind in Ireland. Studies of them in America have focused on peculiarities of culture. Hillbillies, frontier, soldiering, later soldiering, folk and country music, the Foxfire books, humble class status, limited geographies, feuds, NASCAR, and troubles with OxyContin. And you may see J.D. Vance or James Webb for such books. But there are other sides to the enduring remnants of Scots culture, largely ignored, sometimes not even written into histories of the frontier of the West. That West which was different from what we now know as the West, which came after 1865. There are churchways blended into the very definition of mainstream Protestantism and middle-class culture among these remnants of Scottish culture. These were the Scots-Irish, in my experience, who helped propel the American Revolution, yet remained true in devotion to its cause, a liberty ordained by the Almighty, in order to free the enslaved to aid them on their way north. I wonder how much of Appalachia was involved in this. Parts of eastern Tennessee were pro-Union, for example. For a meaning from revolution to continued ideals of equality and freedom, look at a fine study of rural settlements throughout the old Northwest Territory, the blood and sinew of the land, by Annalisa Cox. I think there's a slide of her book. There it is. Also, consult LaRoche, mentioned at the beginning. For a northward-facing branch of the railroad involving blacks and whites, we may examine Anne Hagedorn's Beyond the River, a literary nonfiction account of the 1820s through 50s, Ohio River Valley, focused on Reverend John Rankin and his family, operating interracially in efforts toward freedom. There is another branch to the west of Ripley, Ohio, and northwest of Cincinnati, which is Decatur County, Indiana. We know of its involvement with Rankins because of old ties of church and family. Attorney William Smith has researched much of this. I would like to posit that the Fugate Township, Decatur County, Scots-Irish who settled there in the 1820s decided to be near an African-American settlement which preceded it by a few years. They also employed people from the settlement on their farms. This network of blacks and whites had seen up close what slavery did to people, both to the owned and the corrupted owner in northern Kentucky. And you can see Edward Baptist's very great research on this, which I've footnoted. My mother's Thompsons had moved to Carlisle in northern Kentucky in the early 1790s from Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. They were central to forming an anti-slavery church called Concord Presbyterian at Carlisle, Kentucky. They accompanied the Donnells and others in this move. That means the move from Pennsylvania, following a common Scottish immigration pattern. Follow your pastor and or your church, often driven by reasons of poverty and other crises. American land and real estate patterns, sell high where you are and buy low where you are going, were already in place. There were many events of the 1780s and 90s worldwide which would have influenced the struggle for liberty. In 1780, Pennsylvania was the first state of the new nation to abolish slavery. In the Northwest, its ordinance of 1787 did not allow slaveholding. You can see Annalisa Cox for her exposition of its statutes, though this was often circumvented by indenture. The volatile French Revolution of many years duration, initially extended the hand of friendship to the Haitian Revolution in 1791. The United States were terrified of people of African descent rising up, though they wanted nothing less than that for which many of the rest of us had risen in 1776. And in 1794, Philadelphia was witness to the first abolition convention. The Presbyterian Church also declared against slavery. The Thompsons had landed in Kentucky at an opportune time, circa 1792, after scouting by their eldest, my fifth great-grandfather, William. Father James was aging, and we would too if we had joined the militia at age 48 in 1778. Yet he would last another 25 years until 1817. Mother Mary was fit and probably still in fine singing voice. A remarkable feature, notes the tree, at age 56 in 1792. Her youngest daughter was 12 years old, and the three other children born in Pennsylvania would thrive, marrying and farming in Kentucky or Indiana. And some of the Irish born were still back in Pennsylvania, and that's where they would thrive. One, John, born in Pennsylvania, would be trained under the Reverend Robert Finley for the ministry at Finley's school attached to Cane Ridge Presbyterian Church in the early 1790s. Bringing in a bit of Tennessee history, Hagedorn relates how Reverend Rankin and his recently married Jean Lowry in 1816, they were married, were ousted from the Union Presbytery of Tennessee in the summer of 1817. Quote, time and again, his visions of equality would far exceed the understanding of those far more powerful than he, including the leadership of his church. The Rankins were headed to a free state, they thought, in Ohio, but they were waylaid, so to speak, by an aspiring congregation, very avid to hear Mr. Rankin preach the anti-slavery gospel. The Church of Thompsons and Donnells in Concord had, in 1807, along with 12 other churches, formed the Kentucky Abolition Society. And there's a copy of part of that letter, which shows just the really, plaintive cry, could you please help us out here? And we realize that you've accomplished a lot, and I think they're referring to the 1780 law in Pennsylvania against slavery. But their president, Tarrant, T-A-R-R-A-N-T, seemed to be just isolated, wondering when help would come. The church-based network of the Kentucky Abolition Society called for, of course, abolition, justice for those held in bondage, education of Black children, and anti-slavery sermons and speeches. The KAS survived for about 14 years. In echo of what happened at the 1792 Constitutional Convention of Kentucky, the state was just not going to decide to become a free state. I thoroughly recommend that you look at the address of David Rice to the convention. It has great insight into the dynamics of cultural conflict and powerful psychological and economic analyses of prejudice. Maybe he should be called the Apostle of Kentucky, more than being the first Presbyterian preacher to evangelize. His words were tragically prescient. Rankin's brother-in-law, Samuel Lowry, followed John and Jean to Kentucky from Tennessee. Lowry relations are interwoven in the Thompson family tree, even going back to Westmoreland County, from which many had migrated. And Samuel Lowry would be the first preacher at Kingston Church in Decatur County, Indiana. Almost as if John Rankin and he had plotted to create the broad network of anti-slavery in new states where they settled. Before the point of breaking with Kentucky in 1822, Rankin led Concord Church for 3 years while it tried to educate enslaved children. Educators and children were horribly beaten for it. When I say breaking point, 1822 was a hinge in time when both the Abolition Society dissolved and much of Concord Church had to leave the South forever. The Panic of 1819, I suppose it was across the nation, had not helped either. And in 1822, events and at the aftermath of the Denmark-Vesey uprising at Charleston, South Carolina, brought new tensions everywhere over slavery and freedom. If you read the details, it becomes horrific. You would be hanging your head in shame to read that this was part of American history. Researcher William Smith estimates that the migration of Concord's community to Decatur County, Indiana, was from 120 to 150 people. At the same time that Jean and John Rankin were setting up housekeeping in Ripley, Ohio, positioned along the river on a high bluff with a beacon lamp in their window. The pastor built up a fine church. The Rankins lived to the south of 2 major settlements of African Americans, the Gist settlements. Hagedorn tells how these 950 formerly enslaved people had come several years earlier, manumitted and brought to live on former Virginia military land owned by the British entrepreneur Samuel Gist. A major line or lines of the railroad extended through this area and its towns, Sardinia, Red Oak, etc., to the north and west of Ripley. A similar pattern was in place at Fugate Township in Indiana, beginning with the Snelling family, or even before them, 3 blacks who had settled along the Franklin and Decatur County borders before white abolitionists showed up. I would like to see more accounts of how people owned land, lived, farmed, and worked to free their brethren and sisters, but bonus menu shows how this happened in exemplary cases. And I think we have a slide of the map again. Yes, thank you. Her stories of former Northwest Territory achievement are based on public records and histories of hundreds of families and communities. There was often a valiant, and you can see in the slide, 338 total that she's been able to record. There was often a valiant struggle against terrifying threat and attack, both legal and physical. Her research shows that raise yourself by your bootstraps was exemplified by African American entrepreneurs long before the motto became current in the 20th century, usually as an admonition and a proof test. So many were persecuted for doing that exactly, pulling themselves up, in the early half of the 19th century. And especially the persecution was where success was achieved. There were eyes on their land and the work they had done, covetous eyes afflicted by prejudice. There was fear and a lack of comprehension, a turning of blind eyes on the aspirations of others. It got worse until 1850, and then even worse after 1850, when so many free communities had to flee. And the surrounding climate of acquiescence was then, as now, a large part of the picture. There was legislation being passed by state legislatures reflecting passive and active aggressions. Anne Hagedorn narrates the struggle of the railroad with characters like the Collinses and Campbells of Ripley, Dresser, Mahan, Lovejoy, and Weld. There are skirmishes and incidents worth telling, though none showing such bravery and strategy as those of John P. Parker, active from 1845 in Ripley. His autobiography, His Promised Land, was discovered at the Duke University archives only a few decades ago and published in 1996. Accelerating violence in the 1830s was met by growth of the Underground Railroad. For example, Ohio Anti-Slavery Society, with 120 local groups by 1836, up from 25 the year before. In the pre-Civil War of the 40s and 50s, mobs and riots, slave catching, and large bounties placed upon Rankin and on Parker were the norm. Itinerant anti-slavery preaching was a big part of this whole dynamic. Rankin lost his pulpit in 1846, but he grew a new church, the Free Presbyterian, which was explicitly anti-slavery. And this was also the time of the parties. There was a big switch in the 40s toward the politicization of the movement, away from the moral to the political. I mean, the emphasis was on both, but there were new parties being formed, and those parties would lead to the beginning of the Republican Party, which was anti-slavery and which has been forsaken for much of our history. Parker called the Ripley group, to which he belonged, the intermediary between the spirit of revolutionary patriots and the fiery New England group. In other words, that surrounding William Lloyd Garrison, beginning about 1830. So he was cognizant of this link, this continuity in the American history. I have found this to be true of abolition forces at Fugate Township in Decatur County, Indiana, in or nearby to which area the bulk of the Concord Church from Kentucky had gone. Their parents may have left revolutionary comrades in the graveyard of their previous church, Old Salem Church in Westmoreland, but the children were going to flourish in a township which was side by side with the Snellings and others, all making new lives for themselves as well. One free Black lady, Jane Speed, owned 80 acres in her own name, which was a remarkable thing for any woman of that time, and even more remarkable for an African-American woman. The vast majority of Black families at Fugate Township had to flee north after 1850, while the Scottish whites were able to remain. Still, the routes of the railroad remained open, through Fort Wayne, then Toledo, and then on to Detroit, and often continuing into Canada. Smith says that the conductor Baptiste, operating out of Madison, Indiana, on the Ohio River and to the southwest of Decatur County, was part of this network. And you can go to the Wright Museum in Detroit to find out more about that. I'm convinced that aspects of the way we live now make us think that history was somehow permanent, or people didn't move around very much. But there was a great deal of movement. Parker and Tubman are examples. Hagedorn shows the 1850 cholera and the fugitive slave law that year as parallel. The latter, a blight of a different kind, a plague of prejudice. The new law, practically made to be broken, was exactly what it pronounced. Anyone accused of fleeing or anyone accused and convicted of aiding them could be enslaved or jailed. It made fugitives of virtually all Black and brown people and enabled situations for their enslavement. And so, yes, it decreed that there would be fugitives and slaves, the fugitive slave law. Secrecy increased, resentments grew, but aid to the railroad swelled as never before. Kingston Church and its community declared themselves as belonging to the Free Presbyterian Church in 1850. And at that location, there was a very important case brought to the Supreme Court of Indiana, the Caroline case, which was based on her and her 4 children escaping slavery and being helped by the community around Kingston Church, 1847. So Kingston became part of the Free Presbyterian Church in 1850. There would be many ties between Rankins and Hamiltons, McCoys, and Donnells, alongside of Thompsons and others, over these years and in years to come. Ripley, Ohio had to decide as a community to be neutral during the Civil War because everybody knew what would happen otherwise. It would have been armed battle between posses and bloody ground between warring houses. Everyone should know by now, as the Scots knew then from their history, that there are no wars quite like those with religious and ethnic backdrops to provide the fuel and borders to fight over, wars over identity and who we are destined to be. The 5 Rankin boys, David Wilmot had died of typhoid in 1827, would all go serve the Union in the war, and all would return whole. They had learned a lot about war, even without much use of their arms during the 30 and more years before an officially named Civil War rent the country in two. Their father, he died 20 years later in 1886, having borne the scars of a martyr for his country and his church. Others had died earlier in that struggle and would see success perhaps only from the afterlife in which they believed. Jean Rankin died in 1878. And the many thousands gone, to quote Ira Berlin's book title, and the formerly enslaved, those who survived often prospered, whether at Cass County in southwest Michigan, in Detroit, or in nearby Ontario. The poignant stories of their return to Ripley to offer thanks, we may think of them as a great testimony to the legacy of liberty, ours, theirs, or anybody's. Annalisa Cox asks poignantly of the African American farms and other freedom enterprises. Quote, these hundreds of settlements, these thousands of people, rose on the land they worked and loved. They all deserve recognition and remembrance. They helped preserve liberty and equality, defending and growing it on America's first free frontier. And they should never be forgotten. They were there. Some still are. There may not be much that we can say or do as an encore, except in the work which we ourselves do, in the history that we make, and the histories that we may seek to revive and tell, in order to show our very truest and surest of foundation. Thank you.
Thanks, Rex. It's so interesting to see how you wove your family history in with these books and how these books inspired you. And
Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. I am going to do just a couple of housekeeping slides and then we'll answer some questions. So hang hang tight, everybody. Next week, May 22nd, we're discussing leadership with Doug Johnson and Strauss Scantlin. So join us again next week. In addition, I wanted to tell you that coming soon, we will have some Bookworm apparel. Thank you to Chris, who is our new digitization technician, for designing this great motif to put on our apparel. So that's pretty exciting. And thank you everybody for all of your support of the Bookworm. It's really been a wonderful community building program, and we really do enjoy having you with us every week. Anne has posted in the chat that there are past recordings and resources available on the website. So if you missed any episodes, please check them out there. And also, we very much appreciate your financial support as well. So I know many of you already support us, and we thank you very much for that. If you would like to support future bookworms, please go ahead and visit the link in the chat to do so, and we appreciate that as well. So next week when you join us, I just want to remind everybody, once you've signed up for the Bookworm, you are subscribed to the series. So you do not need to subscribe again. The same link will work, and you will receive a reminder an hour before the program with the link once again. If you are unable to join us in person, you will still receive the email and the recording. All right, so let's take a look at some of our questions for a few minutes. I know Hayley had a chance to answer some of them right here, but maybe we'll read a couple of those in case everybody hasn't had a chance to look at the it. So I'm especially interested in this one as well. Therese asked, to broaden my Hollywood viewing audiences, are there Black feminist films that you recommend?
Yes, and I answered there, and I'll just encourage everyone to both watch Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust. It's the first feature-length film by a Black woman director to get widespread theatrical distribution. That happens in 1992, which is just like shockingly late. It's a film that she's drawing on the narrative strategies of Bambara and also the strong visual language of Morrison. And you might recognize the film as showing up in Beyonce's recent visual album, Lemonade. So Beyonce is really, it's an homage to Julie Dash, who is just sort of groundbreaking Black woman director who got her training at UCLA, got training at AFI, and is now finally, that was her first like feature-length debut. She's now finally going to make her sophomore film, apparently a biopic about Angela Davis. So we can look forward to that. My other big plug is Kathy Collins, whose work I just find absolutely amazing. She's a writer as well as a filmmaker, and her film has finally gotten the audience that it deserves. Her 1982 film, Losing Ground, about a Black woman philosophy professor, that I think is fantastic, and I think is available through UM's library website.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those. Let's see. This one looks like it's for Rex. Tom Wagner says, as a dependent of Levi Coffin, the Quaker so-called president of the Underground Railroad, wasn't it a great act of faith that the conductors did not know who the others were when passing fugitives except to the next station?
Yeah, and I think that speaks to how the mystery, you know, and for us, the continuing mystery of the railroad was conceived in people having to not know, that they had to not see, they had to trust. Yeah, amazing. Yeah. But the coffin house is, for me, it was an experience, you know, me, the time traveler, to, you know, just feel, you know, what was going, especially when I went down to the cistern below, and this was with a group of um, civil rights scholars and so forth, and whew, you know, it was powerful. Yeah.
Wow, I bet. Thomas Wagner also mentions that Northern courts would often free conductors because the testimony of fugitive slaves was not admissible.
Yes, there were many clever legal ploys. There were judges involved in the railroad after 1850, especially. You know, our rights in the North were being violated. Our our country as we knew it was going to go away if we didn't put our foot down. So, yeah, there were many. I guess you'd call them upper middle class people at the time who.
All right, so Haley, you also already typed in an answer for this one, but it sounds like an interesting story about Bambara going to Cuba in the 1970s and what she was doing there.
Yeah, so she went in, gosh, I'm not sure what the date was in 1970s, but goes on that trip, goes on one in 85, 86 with a lot of other Black women writers, and then goes on one in 89 with the Hollywood screenwriter Bud Schulberg. And so actually after that 89 one, she and Bud Schulberg come up with this scheme that they're going to host a film festival in the US to bring a lot of the Cuban filmmakers that Bambara has been so excited about meeting and talking with to the US. So they're like imagining this transnational film festival at a time when shall we say, Cuban and U.S. relations were still in the making. And so it doesn't happen, but I think that's an example of sort of Bambara's ambitions for what film can do. I will say too that there's a lot of writers are going on these international trips. So Bambara goes to Vietnam as well. Toni Morrison goes to Cuba along with Maxine Hong Kingston and Leslie Marmon Silko. Harry Stakopoulos writes about this in his forthcoming book, which I probably don't have a link to because I think it's a year out in publication. But really kind of fascinating internationalism that's going on through these sort of writers' trips abroad.
Great, thank you. So we have from Frank Butwin a question for Rex. I would have thought that there would be more historic African-American settlements near Oberlin, Ohio. Do you know anything?
I thought that too, and maybe that's history to be written. Maybe it's there, but not, you know. And the tremendous job that's already been done by Annalisa, you know, it's like it's just groundbreaking, eye-opening, you know, a testament to the history that was, and it continues.
Right. Do either of you have any questions for each other?
I was wondering about the kind of continuity between the political exiles. I think there were some, you know, terrible, what did they call it, takeovers of planes to fly to Cuba. You know, that was maybe late 60s, early 70s. And were there continuities between the liberation movements and the artistic people going to Cuba or Algeria, Africa.
Yeah. Well, I'm doing some research now on Maya Angelou's time in Ghana, where she is there in the early 60s, and she becomes friends with Malcolm X. Malcolm X, Shirley Graham Du Bois. And so certainly there are these intersections between whether they're just trips or expatriate communities, and the type of internationalist voyaging that freedom fighters are doing. But I, to be honest, I don't know the full Cuban history on that question as well. But I know that if the books aren't out now, there are a number of really excellent scholars who are writing about these various writing trips to Cuba. So Erica Edwards, I think, has something that should be out soon-ish.
Interesting.
Thank you. Linda and Jim Wilson, who I know trace their ancestry to Ohio, are wondering if you know anything, Rex, about Renville, Ohio, and Kilvert, Ohio.
I think Hagedorn has a very good kind of synopsis of what happened at Granville. And it was a convention in a hostile environment, and they had a parade after their gathering, their anti-slavery gathering, and I think they were pelted out of town. So yeah, you could, look into that.
All right. Well, thank you both for your commentary today and all of your excellent book recommendations and things for us all to think about, all of the different connections in our lives, and how art and activism and history intersect, as well as our own families. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much
Welcome.
for having us, Angela, and thank you to all of you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thanks to the Clements.